So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Our folks, welcome back to the podcast. Very excited to have as my guest today, Justin B. Long. Justin, welcome.
Thanks, guys. Great to be here.
Awesome. So Justin is an author, business owner of a successful veterinary practice, and the host of the hit podcast, Straight from the Horse Doctor's Mouth, which he produces with his wife, Dr. Erica Lacher. Is that pronounced right?
Lacher.
Lacher. Justin's
Very
mission
close.
is to make the world a better place for people by helping men learn to understand themselves and grow into their full potential. His current book, The Righteous Rage of a 10-Year-Old Boy, is a raw, intense examination of his childhood, the traumatic events that formed his negative self-image, and his journey through therapy to overcome it all. Justin, thanks for being here.
I'm so excited to have this conversation.
Appreciate it. So before we get going, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
I'm currently in Florida. I live right outside of Gainesville, Florida. I moved here to be with my wife in 2014. Prior to that, I lived all my adult life in Georgia, where I ran away to be in the Army as soon as I could get away from home when I got out of high school. But I grew up in Oklahoma and went to high school in Wyoming. So
Oh, wow.
I've started out in the Midwest and have stayed as far away from there as possible ever since.
So let's dive in here. How did this start for you? What was going on?
Everything that I understand about my life is stuff that I know in retrospect, right? I've learned all of this along the way, looking back. But I grew up in a very emotionally dysfunctional household with a mom and a dad who both came out of emotionally dysfunctional households, and they had no parenting skills, they had no adulting skills, they just didn't really understand how to do life, I think. But I didn't understand any of that at that time. All I knew was that my dad was always angry, and the only emotion he ever knew how to express was rage. And that he believed in work. If we weren't sleeping, we should be working. That was his philosophy, and that's what he impressed on me as far back as I can remember. And so, I would come home from school and I'd have this long list of chores that I'd have to do every day. Like in the wintertime, I would have to chop firewood and stack that in this rack that he had behind the house. And so I would come home from school every day and make this stack of firewood. It had to be perfect within the rack. It
Oh my
couldn't be
God.
any pieces sticking out the front or the back, or it had to be flat across the top. All this stuff, right? And move on to my next chore and do all the stuff that was on my list for the day. And then my dad would come home from work, and we would go inspect all of the things that I was supposed to do, and we'd count the pieces of firewood that were sticking out of the stack more than an inch, and I would get a
And
spanking
how
for
old are you
those.
at this age?
Probably starting at 5 or 6 and moving all the way up into teenage years. So, but I never ever got the firewood stack right. It was never perfect. And all the other chores that I had, there's always shortcomings, right? So the lessons I learned from my dad were that I am never going to get the pat on the back that I did a good job. I will always be punished no matter how hard I work, and I'm going to come up short. And my mom was not a disciplinarian at all. She was very emotionally fragile, I think. But she turned to extreme religiosity trying to find her answers. And she thought that, if she found the right way to get God's attention, that he would solve all of her problems. But that never happened, obviously. But she was not a disciplinarian either. And so when I would act up or be too loud or, run my mouth, things that kids do, she would have me pull the big trash dumpster in from the curb, and I would sit inside that and wait for my dad to come home to give me a spanking for whatever I'd done, so I could, think about what I did. And so, my mom basically threw me away, rejected me. I've learned that all the things that I knew about myself to be true from my parents, which was that I'm never going to be good enough. I don't have any value. I can be discarded easily. Nobody cares about me. And I carried that stuff all the way into adulthood without ever questioning it. I formed those beliefs about myself when I was too young to understand the big picture of what was going on. I just had the information that I had. I was a smart kid. I thought I was drawing the right conclusions, and I never doubted that. But I also couldn't question my parents and what they were telling me, because to question my parents was to question God, and that is never acceptable, and I would go to hell. That was all impressed on me very young, that the parents are always right no matter what, and you cannot question that. And so my parents rejected me. I rejected myself.
Did you have siblings?
Yes, I have a sister that's 6 years younger than me and a brother that's 11 years younger.
So Man, um, I appreciate you sharing that, and it's nothing short of Jesus, heavy duty. So you live through this. This is your reality. How uh, are you coping? How is this manifesting in your life? This abuse, which is what it
Right.
was. Yeah.
It started out, the first tool that I had available to me was books, reading books. We didn't have a television in my house, but I was encouraged to read. And I found reading Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys and the Bobbsey Twins and Tom Swift Jr., that stuff helped me escape my reality. If I was in the book, I wasn't in the real world. And I think I started reading at 4 or 5, and I spent every available opportunity reading to be out of my life. And that got me in a lot of trouble too, because I would shirk chores and I would be reading in class at school because where I wanted to be was anywhere but here. Because when I was in that book, I felt okay about myself. I could be part of what was going on, and I was okay. And when I got into high school, I discovered alcohol. Alcohol solved all my problems. Alcohol made me feel good about who I was and where I was and what I was doing. It gave me the courage to be belligerent to my dad. It made me feel like I was a whole person, and I clung to that with both hands. I drank as much as I could, as often as possible, starting at about 15, 16 years old. And and at that time, I was able to buy alcohol from the liquor stores in town, and so I didn't. I mean, every weekend I was drinking, and by the time I uh, ran away from home, or right out of high school to join the army and get away from home, I was drinking daily. And the laws of diminishing returns certainly apply to that. Like, it worked great in the beginning, but then it worked less and less and less because inside I still hated who I was. I still hated myself. I was filled with shame, and I had all of those insecurities that I formed from those negative self-beliefs. So alcohol couldn't solve that stuff long term. It just hid it for a while. But for a little bit, I really felt like everything was okay. That was my big coping tools. Reading, then alcohol and cigarettes. Anything that I could do to either make me feel like I was somewhere else or to change the way that I feel right now.
So at what point did you begin to look at yourself and look at what was going on and decide things needed to change?
It was so gradual that I don't think there was ever a rock bottom moment where I was like, "Oh my God, this is not okay anymore." My self-loathing grew and grew and grew, where I was just miserable all the time. Even when I was drinking, I was miserable. I hated myself. I needed attention and approval from other people, and when I was drinking, I would seek that through sexual attention from other people in my friend group, and even though I was in a long-term relationship, I didn't that approval didn't work for me anymore. I needed it from someone else, and it was all unconscious. I just knew that when I was in pursuit of somebody else, I felt good, especially if I could get some of that attention. But then the next day, I would be so filled with shame
Mhm.
for what I did last night that the morning shame became a huge part of my life, whether I'd done anything to actually deserve that or not. And I just got to the point where I could not imagine living my life like this for the next 30 or 40 years. It just I didn't have any desire to live anymore. And I worked with a guy who drank like I drank, and we commiserated a lot in the morning, sweating out our hangovers. And one day, I repeated a line that I heard a stand-up comedian say. So one time, it says, I have a drinking problem, not bad enough to go to a meeting, but I probably ought to do something about this. And I thought that was funny, and I had no idea what it meant. But I used that line with my friend as just kind of a joking that, I really feel bad about myself right now. And so I said that. I said, not bad enough to go to a meeting, but I got to slow down with this stuff. And he said, I've been thinking about going to a meeting. And at that moment, that gave me permission to, like, I liked that guy and I respected him and he accepted me. And
Mhm.
so if it was okay for him to consider going to a meeting, it was okay for me. That gave me permission. And that was a Monday, February 18th of 2008. And I went home from work that day and did some homework on the internet and drank my last 3 beers while I found Alcoholics Anonymous. and determined that there was a meeting 2 blocks from my house at a church right down at the end of the street, but it wasn't until a Thursday. And so I decided to sweat it out and not drink until I went to that meeting and
Wow.
see if there was something there that could help me get this thing under control.
How old are you at this point?
I was 32.
32. Wow. So at any time up to this point, Justin, had you looked back on your life, or were you looking back on your life thinking that what I went through in my childhood was, was the cause of this in a sense?
No,
Yeah.
no, I had no self-awareness at all. I look back at it now. I look at it like I was a pinball, and life was just filled with flippers that knocked me around all over the place. But I had no control over my direction and no sense of where I had been and why. Like zero self-awareness. That was one of the things that I have a lot of problems with the 12-step programs, but one of the things that they did was begin the foundation work of helping me develop some self-awareness and learn how to look within and figure out the why behind the what I'm doing. And I met my mentor there. I was about 2.5 years sober when I met him, and he was an old gay one-eyed Apache Vietnam veteran yoga instructor, just like this scary guy with long hair, and just like he was old and just but he had zen. Like he just oozed, radiated zen. I was like, that's the guy I need to go hang out with.
Well,
And he took me through a workbook called A Gentle Path Through the 12 Steps by Patrick Carnes. And that is when my self-awareness really got fast tracked. Like I dove in deep on that and learned how to like really take apart all the pieces and figure out who I am. And I was appalled at how many layers of mask and facade that I had stacked on top of, stacked on top of, stacked on top of
mm,
before I could get down to the core of who I am, because I had buried myself so deep trying to be what I thought other people wanted me to be so that they would accept me, and just adding pieces on top of that. Like it took me a long time to really get down to who I am, what I like to do, what I believe in. Like I had to reject a whole lot of stuff that I'd been presenting to the world as this is who Justin Long is. And it took me several years to get through that process. But I think that was what I needed to get me ready to get into therapy, so that when I found a trauma therapist, I could hit the ground running and really make the deep changes that I needed to make.
you sound as though I mean, you're obviously someone who's done a lot of self-reflection and cultivated a lot of self-awareness. And it's inspiring to talk to you because of what you've been through. I can't imagine. Um, I'm not familiar with that workbook, but it sounds pretty amazing. Can you just pull out one or two things there that helped you to begin to develop this type of self-awareness?
Oh, there was so much. One of the things was the uh, trauma and abuse family tree. I think that's what it was titled. I may have that titled wrong, but basically it was my family tree of here's my mom, and here was her challenges. Here's my dad. Here was his challenges. The and grandparents and aunts and uncles. And when I started putting all of those pieces together, just from what information I had, I was like, oh my God, like this goes as far back as I know about, in so many different ways. I knew that my mom had a very challenging childhood, and her mom rejected her because she wasn't the pretty young girl that she could take to sewing circle and show off to her friends. You know, her little sister was that person. So my mom got
Mm,
rejected by her mom,
mm,
and my dad was never able to get that pat on the back from his dad, and his dad was a workaholic who never got the pat on the back from his dad.
wow.
And so I knew some of those things, and I could start realizing, filling in the gaps as I learned more about psychology and what makes us tick, and adverse childhood traumas, and all of these things that help us, go down a dark road. And the more I learned about that, the more I realized just how I was never going to avoid any of this stuff. This was a path that the only thing that's unusual about it is the fact that I managed to get off of it. But I was always going to be an alcoholic or a drug addict, or a compulsive gambler, or one of whatever those things are that make me try to be okay with myself for a day. like I was never going to be able to avoid that based on all of the landmarks that I hit on my way to adulthood.
So when you first started seeing a therapist and you said trauma therapist, was that a conscious decision? I need to see a trauma therapist?
No, my first therapist, I've had two. I had one in Georgia when I lived up there, and I I was still scared to death of the idea of therapy because I still clung to all of these ideas of masculinity and that men don't do that kind of stuff, right? I had a head full of that. Even though I was developing willingness, it took me a while to come around to the point of asking for straight up mental health help. So I went to a therapist under the guise of needing anger management because I have a temper. And I felt like that was a way for me to get in the door that I could find acceptable within myself, right?
Hmm.
And I found a wonderful woman in Midway, Georgia, who really took me on the therapy train of just getting comfortable with the idea of talking to a stranger about the things that hurt me inside, right? And I worked with her for about a year before I met my wife, who lived down here in Florida. And so when I moved to Florida, um, at that point, I knew that I needed to deal with my childhood traumas. I hadn't had time to get into all that with my previous therapist. So, but I found a trauma therapist who does EMDR, and that was what I felt like everything in my life had been building me towards. That was my big
Wow.
moment.
Wow. So what was it like when you began to think about your childhood as traumatic?
It was difficult. You know, I had, I think, months of therapy with my second therapist, with my trauma therapist, before she really pinned me down and made me admit that my parents abused me. Like I could not say those words out loud. Like just, I would say, you know, there were lots of people that had it worse than me. Like I had rough stuff, but there were, you know, it's not like my dad was putting cigars out on my forehead or something like that, you know?
Right.
And it was painful. But once I finally just acknowledged, yes, my parents abused me. They were wrong. That I was like I broke through into a new space where I could just like that's the reality. We're not hiding stuff anymore. We're acknowledging truth, and if it's against my parents, then that's okay.
Hmm.
You know, they it's not that they were bad people, but they did lots of bad things, and it's okay for me to acknowledge that. And I think once that happened, that allowed me to just like move without any constraints in that space anymore.
So that what was it, an unwillingness to admit your parents had abused you? Was it that you didn't want to acknowledge that your parents had abused you, or was it that you didn't want to then be a victim, or both?
I think it was that I didn't want to speak ill of my parents. Like my dad was already dead at that point,
Hmm.
and you know, I had a ton of unresolved stuff with him, but uh, I really I felt guilty about saying something negative about my dad because he's dead, and I felt guilty about saying something negative about my mom because she's not dead. It's like it was a ridiculous notion that I had, but I felt like I had to protect their reputation or something like that.
So you start working with this therapist, EMDR comes into play. What happens?
I had such a profound experience. Um, we started off just, I mean, we hit the ground running on this stuff. I made my list of traumas to work through, and we hit those once a week. And I realized probably by my third or fourth session that I was realizing so much stuff about myself that I need to write this down. So I started journaling. I would go home and try to write down everything that happened in the session just so I wouldn't lose it, because what I found was that you know, when we would go back and revisit some of these memories, like the wood stack, when I would go back and stand beside 6-year-old Justin and my dad and looking at that pile of wood, you know, I could see that with my adult perspective and what I understand today, and I could see what was going on and realize that
Mm.
6-year-old Justin did a great job. Like he stacked that wood all the way to the top and filled the wood box inside every day. And the house was always warm because he did all the things that he needed to do in that moment. And it didn't matter if it was stacked straight or not. It wasn't about him at all. That was about my dad.
Hmm.
And, and once I had 3 or 4 of those realizations in different situations, I was like, oh my God, like 8-year-old Justin sitting in the trash can had nothing to do with 8-year-old Justin's inability to be quiet when mom was on the phone. That was about mom not having any idea how to be a good mother, right? And and that really like profoundly changed my understanding of who I always was, and that I was always good enough, and I persevered and I did all the things that I was supposed to do, and I went above and beyond in a lot. I never gave up. Like I did all the things, and that's amazing. That's not someone to be ashamed of. That's someone to be proud of. And like that just alters everything that I know about myself to be true, right? That and over the course of a year of that, every week over and over and over, examining this stuff, talking it out, shining the flashlight on all the dark spots, I realized that, even 25-year-old Justin, who I really had a hard time finding compassion for because 25-year-old Justin was a raging alcoholic and wildly inappropriate in almost every situation he was in. I understand why he was that way and how he got there. And of course he was acting out like that. He was a wounded bird and he needed love and he couldn't find it anywhere. Like I have compassion and love for 25-year-old Justin now. That
Wow.
was a hard place for me to get to, but when I got to that point, that was when everything about me was fundamentally different. And that positive self-image and confidence that comes along with that, like I've never experienced that in my life. And I've felt this way about myself for 5 years now, and I hope it never ever goes away. I hope the novelty doesn't wear off because I love this. It's so different.
Wow. So you mentioned that you started journaling. Let's talk about the book, The Righteous Rage of a 10-Year-Old Boy. How did that come about? When did that come about?
That started out as the journal. And I got, I don't know, probably 10,000 words written down on this thing. And I've written several other books, so I understand how the structure of a book and putting it all together. And I realized at that point, I was like, I have an insight here that has changed everything about my life. And while my experiences were my experiences, the insecurities that I formed as a result of those things are the same as everybody else has. And
Hmm.
the way the behaviors that I have as an adult, like my inability to accept criticism from anybody, especially a supervisor or somebody that has power and control over me, like all of those behaviors that I had as an adult, like are results of those insecurities and the same thing that everybody else has. And the fact that I was able to overcome those insecurities and change the way that I feel about myself, like that's something that the world needs to know. Like that's the magic sauce. That's the magic pill that everybody wants, right? It exists. You just got to be able to do some work. And so I decided that journal has to become a book. And I need to share this with other people because like if I can do this, if I can change the way that I feel about me, if I can go from a suicidal, self-loathing, just feel like I'm a piece of crap and hate my life guy to I love who I am, I love my life, I have a wonderful wife who thinks that I'm a great guy, that's like I can't put words on that. And that's
Hmm.
something that I want to be able to share with as many people as possible. So that's how the book came to be.
That's amazing. I mean, you're so friggin' inspiring, Jesus. So the the work you did on yourself, I mean, it just sounds so uh intense. I mean, and it sounds like you just poured yourself into this. Was it a conscious decision to like get better? Like were you asking yourself, what the hell is going on in my life? I need to move through this. What was going on consciously for you during this time?
Consciously, way back, and I would say, and probably before I even started therapy, back when I was doing that gentle path through the 12 steps, like the progress that I made and the improvements that I experienced in my life as a result of those efforts really got me committed to a path of just continuous self-improvement. And the more I have worked on that, especially once I got into therapy and started doing this stuff, the more effort I put in, the more results I get back from that. And it just confirms that continuous self-improvement is a lifestyle that I can embrace. That's something I want to lean into. So, and I'm still on that. I'm working on internal family systems right now and learning all the different parts in my head and the roles that all of my defenders play and all this stuff. And it's fascinating stuff, but the more I understand me, the better I can understand other people. My
Hmm.
wife and I own a business. We've got a staff of 12, and my ability to understand myself makes me a better leader, I think, because I can understand what's going on with other people when they're experiencing challenges. And we all experience challenges. It's not people that have suffered major traumas in their life. Everybody has challenges. But before I had any self-awareness, I had no ability to deal with people like that. I had no patience, had no understanding I would take everything personal. If somebody snaps out, I would assume that it was about me. But now I know it's never about me, you know? And that lifestyle, I think, I don't know if there's an end to that where, I've covered all the bases, but I feel like
Right.
I've still got a long ways to go on it, and I have no intention of slowing down.
Who's the book for?
The book is for a couple of people, I think. One is for people, probably more men, just because of the way our culture kind of frames this. But I think for people who are curious about therapy and what I would say curious and scared, because we're all scared of the unknown, right? But people who don't understand exactly what happens in a therapy session and because of that will never ever voluntarily walk into one. This is a fly on the wall experience for you to walk through a year of trauma therapy with me
No.
and see exactly what it's like. And I think that makes it a lot safer for people to maybe then go try it themselves. They understand what the process is. They understand what the potential results can be, and that it's a known quantity. We know what we're walking into. But the other target audience, I think, for this is therapists. It's been read by a number of them, and they all found it to be useful tools to refer to their clients who are willing to engage in talk therapy, but are nervous about going into some deeper stuff like EMDR. And for that, I think it's a great proof of concept that, and again, to shine the light on exactly what it is without having to walk through it yourself first. So to take the mysterious haze of the unknown away and let people see what it is and that it's a definite worthwhile use of their time and their money.
So the book again is called The Righteous Rage of a 10-Year-Old Boy. We'll have that linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. So Justin, your website is uh J how do you want to pronounce that?
Well, Boyd is my middle name,
Okay.
Boyd. So I could say
Okay.
J Boyd Long,
Okay.
JBoydLong.com.
We'll have that linked up here also. Um, so people will go to your website and what can they learn about you? What do you have there?
There's a links to an awful lot of podcasts that I've been on. All of my books, I've written 8 books so far.
Wow.
My most popular series is The Adventures of the Horse Doctor's Husband series, which I just put out book 3 on that one. And that one's fun stuff about crazy horse emergencies and stuff that I get to see in my life. That just most people don't ever have any exposure to that, right? So that's fun stuff. I've also got a sci-fi series on there that's my true passion. And but I've got a blog that's got a lot of self-help and personal growth stuff in there, and then just random fun stuff that I think people might get a kick out of.
Awesome. Awesome. We'll have that linked up again here. Uh, Justin, love to have you back. Whenever you want, man. Just, it's I mean, what you've gone through is crazy. There's no denying it. But you just emanate this what compassion, this self-awareness, this ac- I don't want to acceptance. I'm talking to you and I can feel that you acknowledge what you've gone through and you've moved through it. It's not like you've denied it. You've moved through it and you've come out. Not to say that it's over, but you've certainly grown into this amazing person. Really appreciate you being here.
I appreciate you saying that very much.
Yeah.
It's funny that I've finally to the point where I don't seek external validation anymore, but it sure feels good when I get it.
Yeah, well, it's who you are, man. Again, appreciate you being here and look forward to having you back. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, man. Take care.